Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we are diving straight into the heart of a breaking news story. A ceasefire just announced between Israel and Hezbollah. It's been 14 really tough months of conflict, sparked by that Hamas attack on Israel and then Hezbollah joining the fray shortly after. But now, this. A potential pause in the fighting. It feels like the whole world is sort of holding its breath, to
Yeah,
see what happens.
it really is fascinating, isn't it? Like we're watching history unfold in real time right in front of us.
Okay, so let's unpack what we know about this ceasefire agreement. It's set to go into effect at 10 a.m. tomorrow morning, and there are a lot of moving parts here. Over the next 60 days, the IDF, that's the Israeli Defense Forces, they'll be gradually scaling back their operations in southern Lebanon. And at the same time, Hezbollah is supposed to withdraw its forces 25 kilometers north of the Litani River, basically pulling back from those front lines.
And this is where things get especially interesting. The Israeli troops won't just be leaving a vacuum there. They'll be gradually replaced
Right.
by a combination of the Lebanese army and the UN peacekeeping force that's already there on the ground, beautiful.
Right, right.
Oh, and just to make things even more, uh, I guess you could say, complex, there's a five-nation international committee led by the U.S., that's going to be responsible for monitoring the situation, making sure everyone's sticking to the plan.
So a phased withdrawal with international oversight, it really does make you wonder, though, why now? What's driving this sudden push for a ceasefire?
Well, there are a couple of key factors at play here. The first one is pretty straightforward. It's practical. The IDF has been engaged in really intense fighting for months now, and there have even been reports of delays getting them the ammunition and weapons they need. So this ceasefire basically gives them a chance to regroup, replenish their supplies, address any of those logistical challenges.
So a chance to catch their breath and figure out their next steps.
Yeah,
Makes sense.
exactly.
But taking a break mid-conflict in a situation like this, it has implications beyond just restocking supplies, right?
Absolutely. And that brings us to that second reason for the ceasefire, a more strategic one. By getting Hezbollah out of the picture, at least for now, the conflict becomes more contained. It lets Israel focus on dealing with Hamas, potentially weakens that combined threat. It's a classic divide and conquer strategy.
Right, divide and conquer. But of course, in a situation this complex, you're never going to have everyone agreeing on the best way forward.
Oh, absolutely.
And the ceasefire is no exception.
Nope. For example, in Israel, you've got Attar Ben-Gvir, the national security minister. He's been very publicly critical of this agreement. He believes that Israel had Hezbollah on the ropes and that this ceasefire is a missed opportunity to, well, to really strike a decisive blow and neutralize that threat from Hezbollah for good.
So he's basically arguing that Israel should kept pushing for a total victory, even if it meant, making the conflict go on longer. It makes you think about the people who are actually there on the ground, caught in the crossfire. Would they agree with him?
That's a really tough question.
Hmm.
And honestly, I don't think there's an easy answer. But it does bring up another really important point. Will this ceasefire actually hold? Back in 2006, the war between Israel and Hezbollah, that ended with a UN resolution as well. But then both sides accused each other of breaking the terms.
Right.
So there's definitely, a good deal of skepticism out there about whether this time will be any different.
Yeah, you have to wonder, especially with what we're hearing from Frank Gardner. He's reporting from Jerusalem, and he's talking about this enormous mistrust between Israel and Hezbollah. He says turning this agreement into, actual peace on the ground is going to be a massive challenge.
Yeah, I think he has a point. When you think about it, these are two groups with such a long and honestly difficult history. You know, deep suspicions of each other, completely different ideas about what the future should look like, getting them to trust each other enough to, even temporarily lay down their arms. That's a huge ask.
It really is. And yet, in the middle of all this uncertainty and pessimism, you have President Biden striking this, surprisingly optimistic tone.
Yeah, that's true. For the Biden administration, this ceasefire, it's being presented as a real foreign policy win. Proof that American diplomacy can work on the world stage.
Yeah.
He's even gone so far as to suggest that this could be a foundation for maybe even broader peace efforts in the Middle East, potentially even breathing some new life into that two-state solution for Israel and Palestine. He even directly referenced the Abraham Accords, which, as you remember, normalized relations between Israel and a few different Arab countries.
Right. It's interesting to see how he's He's trying to frame this as like a potential domino effect. But is he being overly optimistic? I mean, does history give us any reason to believe that this could actually lead to, wider peace in the region?
That is the big question. And to be honest, there's a lot of skepticism around Biden's long-term vision.
I bet.
Like, you've got Rowan Bridge. He's over in Washington. And he's been pretty cautious, warning people against getting caught up in all the excitement of the moment. He's pointing out how incredibly complex the situation really is, and he's questioning whether Biden's goals, which are definitely ambitious, are actually realistic given, the deep divisions and mistrust in the region.
So he's basically saying that even though a ceasefire is a step in the right direction, it's just one small step on what could be a very, very long road.
Yeah, I think that's a good way to put it. He's basically reminding everyone that true peace in the Middle East, it requires a lot more than just stopping the fighting. You've got to address those underlying issues, the things that are actually fueling the conflict in the first place.
Absolutely. So we've got this fragile ceasefire. We've got a mix of relief and a lot of skepticism. And of course, tons of uncertainty about what comes next. But there's one piece of this puzzle we haven't even touched on yet, the role of the United States. We'll dive into all of that right after this.
Yeah, the United States has been so involved in this whole thing from the start, providing diplomatic support, military support to Israel. And now with the ceasefire, I mean, their role becomes even more important, don't you think?
Oh, absolutely. They're not just, sitting back watching. The U.S. is actually leading that international committee, the one that's supposed to oversee everything, make sure the agreement is actually implemented. And that's a lot of responsibility, especially when you think about all the broken promises and failed ceasefires in the region.
Exactly. It puts the U.S. in a very, very delicate position. They're trying to balance their commitment to Israel's security with the need to, engage with all the other players in the region, including those who may not see eye to eye with them on the conflict. It's a tough balancing act for sure.
It really is. And, it sounds like President Biden is really putting a lot of faith in the ceasefire, hoping it's going to be a stepping stone to something bigger, maybe even reviving the peace process between Israel and Palestine. But is that even realistic at this point? You look at the history of failed negotiations, the current political climate, it's hard to be optimistic.
Yeah, it's definitely a long shot, you could say. But, we've seen things like this happen before. The Abraham Accords, for example, back when Trump was in office, those normalized relations between Israel and several Arab countries. And a lot of people thought that was totally impossible just a few years before it actually happened. So, maybe, just maybe, Biden's onto something here.
You never know. There's always that element of hope, right? But let's not forget about Iran. They're a huge part of this equation. They're the ones backing Hezbollah, giving them money and weapons. And they've made it pretty clear that they see Israel as an existential threat. So how does that factor into all of this?
Yeah, Iran's involvement definitely throws another wrench in the works. I mean, you've got their ambitions in the region, the whole nuclear program issue, plus their network of, well, let's call them allies, all across the Middle East. All of that could easily derail any kind of lasting peace between Israel and their neighbors.
Yeah, that's a really good point. So we've got this ceasefire that feels very shaky. We've got this long list of issues that haven't been resolved. And then you've got all these powerful players, each with their own agenda, all trying to exert their influence. It kind of feels like we're standing at the edge of a cliff, not knowing if we're about to take a step forward or fall right off.
I think that's a pretty accurate way to describe it. Things are changing so fast, it's hard to predict what will happen. The stakes are incredibly high, and if things go wrong, the consequences could be devastating. But even with all that uncertainty, there's still that glimmer of hope, like we talked about.
I'm curious, what do you think are the most likely scenarios here? What should people be paying attention to as this whole thing plays out?
Well, the first question is whether the ceasefire will actually hold. Will both sides stick to the terms? Or will we see fighting break out again? That's the first big test. If it does hold, then the next critical stage will be the withdrawal of Israeli troops and the deployment of the Lebanese army and UN peacekeepers. That's where things could get a little messy. Any little misstep, any provocation could easily spark things up again.
And what about the bigger picture, the long-term prospects for peace? I mean, is there any realistic way to address the root causes of this conflict, the things that have been driving it for decades?
That's the million-dollar question. I don't think anyone has a clear answer. But we can watch for signs of progress, even small ones, like, are the parties willing to come to the negotiating table in good faith? Or are there any measures they can take to build trust, reduce tensions? Those are the things to look out for.
It's waiting game then, but with a lot riding on the outcome. So what's your take? Are we at a real turning point in this conflict? Or is this just another cycle of violence and temporary ceasefires?
It's impossible to say for sure right now, but I do think this ceasefire offers a window of opportunity, even if it's a small one. It's a chance for diplomacy, for dialogue, maybe even for finding new ways to achieve a lasting peace. The question is whether the parties involved and the international community will seize that opportunity or let it pass them by.
It's amazing how much really rides on this whole ceasefire, not just for Israel and Hezbollah, but for the whole region. We've talked about Biden's hopes and the doubts from some experts, and even Iran's role in all of this. But what about the people who are actually caught in the middle of it all? What about Lebanon?
Oh, that's such an important point. It's so easy to get caught up in all the big picture stuff, the geopolitics, the maneuvering for power. But we have to remember the human cost of this conflict. Lebanon has really been hit hard by the fighting, and their perspective often gets lost.
It's true, they're dealing with so much already. A struggling economy, a huge refugee crisis, and then just the constant threat of violence. If this ceasefire actually works, it could give them some much-needed breathing room.
Exactly. I mean, think about what this means for regular people in Lebanon. The chance to rebuild their lives, to send their kids to school without being terrified, just to have a moment of peace after months of chaos. It could be a real turning point for them.
And beyond that immediate relief, there's also the question of whether the ceasefire could help Lebanon tackle some of its own internal problems.
For sure. They've been struggling with political instability, economic issues, and Hezbollah's influence for years now. If the security situation improves, it could open up possibilities for reform, for economic recovery, maybe even a chance to shift the balance of power within Lebanon itself.
Yeah, it's a chance for them to start fresh in a way. But let's be real, a lot of things have to go right for that to happen. And even then, there are no guarantees.
That's true. The damage from this conflict is deep, and the road to recovery is going to be long and difficult. But people are incredibly resilient, and we've seen time and time again that even in the toughest situations, there's always hope.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, we're left with this feeling of, well, cautious optimism, I guess, and a real understanding of just how challenging the situation is. Any final thoughts for our listeners? What should they be watching for as this story continues to unfold?
I think the biggest takeaway here is that we're at a crossroads. This ceasefire, it's a fragile opportunity, a chance to step away from the edge of even more violence. But it's just a first step. The next few weeks will be crucial to see if this holds and if it can actually set the stage for a more lasting peace.
Okay, so what should our listeners be keeping an eye on specifically?
Well, watch for any signs of the ceasefire breaking down, any provocations. Pay attention to how things develop between Israel, Hezbollah, and the Lebanese government. And most importantly, don't forget about the people who are caught in the middle of all this, their hopes and their dreams for a better future.
It's a powerful reminder. It's easy to get lost in the politics and the strategy. But at the end of the day, this is about people's lives. Well, this deep dive has certainly given us a lot to think about. Hopefully, it's helped you understand this complex situation a little bit better. And remember, things are changing constantly, so stay informed, stay engaged, and keep asking those tough questions. Thanks for joining us on the deep dive.